Pick your class and
earn your battle points.
Because it's time for the Star Wars Battlefront podcast.
This episode of the Star Wars Battlefront podcast is brought to you by our patrons on Patreon. Head over to patreon.com/Battlefront podcast to help support this show. We're also brought to you by our PayPal supporters, paypal.me/tie-dye-sheep, TYEDYESHEEP.
Welcome to episode 103 of the Star Wars Battlefront podcast. I'm your host, Sage Goodwin, joined by scientific illustrator and all-around prequel master, Glendon Mellow.
Hello.
In this episode, we'll be going over why gamers like the prequels more than the average moviegoer, prequel tidbits in Battlefront 2015, and much more. Let's get started.
Sector is clear. Not clear. Not clear.
So, I was thinking we get started with the prequel tidbits in Battlefront 2015. And
sure.
You came to me and you're like, hey, I've got some ideas to talk about the podcast. And I was like, sure, let's do this. What are some of the prequel tidbits in Battlefront 2015?
Well, that's the thing. Like, there's you often see the outcry on Reddit that, and certainly this isn't a universal opinion, but you do hear people sometimes say that since Disney took over, the prequels are getting ignored or left behind.
Yeah.
And I can see why that perception came out there after Clone Wars was sort of abruptly canceled in favor of Rebels, and
it seemed like they were doing that.
Yeah, and the prequels are not universally loved or seen as in the same sort of glowing light that you have with the original trilogy. So people definitely had that perception that, okay, oh look, here comes DICE's Battlefront and it's only original trilogy. But they did pepper through the whole thing a whole bunch of like nice little nods that the prequels existed.
Yeah. And
I mean it's mostly weapons and tech. You do get the Zabrak soldier, which is having that skin is one quick one because they never existed in the original trilogy.
Yeah.
There's two different types of shields. So you've got the everybody's favorite bubble shield.
Activate your personal shield.
Yeah, which even in the descriptions, I believe it mentions that it's based on droideka technology, and it has that look. It has that same look as the droideka shield, and then which is very different from the shield that Leia uses, which comes out in that sort of green, organic-looking kind of light. Looks a bit like plant stem or something coming up, which is much more like what the Gungans were using in Phantom Menace.
Yeah.
And then there's other little bits that are maybe more expanded universe, like the scattergun being brought back from Republic Commando, and then I mean even the Deoxys grenade. Again, it's a Phantom Menace callback to when the Jedi were about to be gassed and just held their breath, as Jedi can do.
Yeah.
So
why can't I do that?
What's that green stuff coming out of the vent? Jeepers, maybe I'll hold my breath. But anyway, these are really, in some ways these are kind of small things. It wasn't like there was a huge Clone Wars map. But it's still, I think it really did lend that same sort of used universe feeling that Star Wars is so famous for. It still gave you these little bits, and some of them are nice little nods too, like the idea that Leia is using a shield based on Gungan technology when her mother's from Naboo. It's
that is awesome.
It kind of raises questions, does Leia know about her mother when she's using the shield? It kind of it's it's an interesting. I like stuff like that when I'm playing the game because it kind of even in the middle of the thrill of the game, you've still got this little, wow, this universe is more connected and so much bigger than it needs to be.
With the older video games, they had they were more standard, so it was like they were working in boxes, but they did add certain things, like there was blood stains on that wall, so you knew something happened in the past. Mm-hmm. in Battlefront 2, you have on Naboo, you have all the civilians running away. You've got these
Yes.
actions that are taking place in the background that are completely unnecessary, but they make you feel more immersed in the world and kind of like, oh wow, this is actually
Hmm.
happening.
Even all the Astromechs that are racing around on Theed or in
Yes.
Theed. I mean, at first I was like, okay, that's sort of an odd choice, but I was like, no, wait a minute. Padme's ship, when they were escaping from Naboo in Phantom Menace. I mean, she had a whole little bay there filled with R2 and a bunch of other Astromechs who met their untimely end trying to repair the royal ship. But I mean, it was definitely something where, yeah, on Naboo, they use Astromechs on Naboo. Like that's not that was totally appropriate to sort of throw them around the environment, much more so than it would be, say, around, you know, Kashyyyk. We didn't see a whole bunch of Astromechs on Kashyyyk, so it makes a lot of sense, and it's a nice nod. It's a nice way of saying that the developers and the level designers understand the movies very well and did their homework before they sat down and said, what are we going to populate this with? And so that type of quality I really appreciate that in DICE's games. I played the old Pandemic games. I played the heck out of those. They were, I mean, the original Pandemic Battlefront was a system seller for me. I got an Xbox just for that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, but I have to say though, as a fan, and this will probably enrage some listeners, but I like DICE's version a lot better.
Me too.
It's just my opinion, but it's so fun. It just really feels like you're right in the Star Wars universe.
Yeah, I'm not going to say all of the people that say that haven't played, but a lot of them are seeing it through the lens of their childhood or nostalgia. So it's like, oh yeah, those mechanics were perfect as I remember them, but they aren't. We have PlayStation 2 with Battlefront 2 on there, and the mechanics aren't great. It's still a fun game.
Oh yeah, yeah. And they did pack a lot of stuff in there. I mean, I have an Xbox 360 that still has the backwards compatibility, so I can still pop in the two of them, even though they're original Xbox games. And and I've played them, and I mean, there's a lot of stuff in those games. And the second one in particular, I mean, the second one really felt full, partly because they brought over, I think a little over half the maps from the first game.
Yeah.
They seemed to leave out any of the ones that had spaceships on the map. So, like you had like the plains of Naboo, which had like a Jedi starfighter on one hill, and they did not bring that from Battlefront 1 to Battlefront 2, but then they did bring Theed, and then just made it nighttime. So it was packed with a ton of stuff, a lot of weird modes. The hunt modes are a fun thing in Battlefront 2.
Yes, they
The
are.
original Battlefront 2. Except I have to say that the joke that they sort of put in with the Ewoks versus Biker Scouts, the fact that you can never ever win as the Biker Scouts, like, I'm pretty sure I'm not that bad a player, but it's actually impossible to beat them.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
The
silly,
Ewoks
but
are too strong with the Force.
Yeah, I mean, they're just whipping those little rocks and stuff at you the whole time, and but I mean, there was a lot of fun mechanics in those games, in the Pandemic games, and I played so many hours of those, I don't even know how many, and all offline at the time. I wasn't an online gamer back then.
Yeah.
But at the same time, DICE's work has it has a love and a care to the worlds of Star Wars that obviously the graphics couldn't match back then what they can now, but also just every little nook and cranny they're paying attention. And when I watched Narwhal Dave's video talking about the secrets of Takodana, and he went through the fruit on the tables, and,
Yeah.
so, and it's like, okay, like, DICE actually has gone to the length of, there's some fruits we recognize, and then there's also some fruits that have appeared in various Star Wars properties, from cartoons to movies, and that are not real, and they've bothered to somebody sat there and modeled those and put them in the game. It's that's awesome.
You
So
you see those fruits on that table? I made those.
I made those fruits.
Yes, someone
So
can say that.
yeah, so it's anyway. So yeah, I think I think the prequels were not really ignored in the first one. I think it was I think they had a nice way of trying to bring some prequel technology into the games. Even Sullust in the Outer Rim DLC, it wasn't Mustafar, but it used pretty similar technology to what we saw. Or well, not even so much as Mustafar. It used pretty similar technology to the droid factory at Geonosis.
Yeah.
Those big cauldron buckets up by the ceiling, and because that's where you want hot lava, is up by the ceiling in some cauldron buckets. And,
Just makes sense.
of course. So
Running freely through the floors.
yeah, exactly. Just leave a little channel here. So
I love what they got to do with Sullust because it was one of those worlds that you've heard about through Star Wars since the beginning. Like in the books, in the movies, in the comic books, like you hear of Sullust, and then we get to see it for the first time expanded in a Battlefront game, which was really cool to get that opportunity. And you can definitely tell that they knew it was a big deal to get that right.
yeah, I think that's exactly it. That I think they really wanted to leave their mark on the Star Wars universe, so that going forward, here's here's a planet mentioned in the movies, and we've seen an alien from it with Nub, and they wanted to really give it a sense of place. And the fact that we saw a few different environments there, because it's not just one map. I mean, there's the giant Walker Assault Supremacy map, but then we also got we got the sulfur fields, which is one of my favorites. It's,
Yeah.
the eerie sort of blueness, that sort of turquoise to the water, and then also there's the evening at the Imperial installation. I can't remember the name of the map off the top of my head right now, but there's the smaller sort of cargo sized map that's like a hangar bay on Sullust, and it has like a nice sort of twilight or early morning kind of a feeling to it.
Yeah.
And the fact that they based them on Iceland, and and went to another real place and another real environment and said, like, let's look at this and recreate this and make it part of Star Wars.
And like you're talking about them leaving a mark on Star Wars, like Criterion developed the official canon design of the cockpit of an X-wing. Like when you see an X-wing in the movies, it's been they've been looking at the ones that Criterion's made. Right.
Yeah. Right. And that's an incredible thing, right? Like it's to be able to. There's only a few instances of that even in Star Wars history, I think. Timothy Zahn came up with the name Coruscant, if I'm correct about that. And I remember him saying that because George Lucas wanted to call the center of the galaxy something like Had Abaddon, and Timothy Zahn then, up until then, it was only known in books as Imperial Center, and Zahn called it Coruscant. And Lucas, in one of the interviews, again, I'm trying to remember a few years back here, but mentioned it and just sort of said, well, this name's out there, so we'll use it. And it was it wasn't his first pick for a name for that planet, but he ended up, going along with it. Timothy Zahn said a really funny thing years and years ago before Disney wiped away the canon. He sort of said that, the thing with Star Wars is anytime you make a new Star Wars story, you're kind of like kids playing with your toys in the driveway. And when George Lucas decides to back the car out and make a new movie, some of your ideas are going to get run over. So, I'm paraphrasing here. I don't remember the exact quote, but he was an author who understood, okay, I'm writing in this universe and I'm privileged enough to create new characters and stories, but ultimately the creation of new canon material is going to get determined by George Lucas. So, he Zahn had his own ideas about clones and how clones were made, and then George wanted to make the prequels and said, well, here's how it happened. And it kind of, it didn't necessarily contradict, but it didn't jibe well with Zahn's vision either. So it kind of it was a good quote, and I do think that's something where Disney was very intelligent about how they decided to go about dealing with old canon and new. When I first heard it, I was like everybody. I was like, what? They're wiping away all these years of books I've read? What a waste of my time. As if I hadn't enjoyed them. But yeah, I mean, it made sense. It was like, okay, it's just going to be, Clone Wars and Rebels and the movies, and then new material that we make sure matches up. And it's been actually quite refreshing, I find. There was no way to make a movie set 30 years after Return of the Jedi and have it match all of those books.
Exactly.
So
where?
like they had every minute covered. Like literally the party on Endor, and they had to take off for Bakura to stop the reptile hypnotizing alien guys, and it was, there wasn't a spare moment. Everything was written down, but they've also then brought back some characters. They brought back Thrawn, and they've, everybody's wondering if Mara Jade's going to show up at some point, and so they aren't just throwing it all out. They're saying, okay, there's still good ideas here, so what can we do to bring them back? But so I think it's actually been pretty exciting that way. You get some really good news stories that are more coherent and I think a little higher quality overall. And then you still get to see some of your favorite expanded universe characters pop back in. I'm getting pretty far astray from the game right now, though.
Yeah. Guest episodes often become Star Wars podcasts.
Apologies, dear listeners.
After a short break, we will get into our main discussion, which is why gamers like the prequels more than the average moviegoer.
Cool.
You're listening to the Star Wars Battlefront podcast, a podcast from the Tie-Dye Sheep Entertainment Podcast Network, a network dedicated to bringing content as great and as weird as the hosts. If you'd like to support us on Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/Battlefront podcast. You can donate $1 up to $10, and we have different tiers for that. So if you'd like to support the show and get some exclusive content, because we'll be doing bonus shows there, you can support us through that link. And at $1 per month, you have the ability to come on the podcast if you so desire. So why gamers like the prequels more than the average moviegoer? And like when you contacted me through DM, I was like, okay, this is the thing that drew me in. I was like, that is a really, really good topic, because like my goal of the podcast is kind of like to talk about the broader things of Battlefront. Like we don't really cover news in a frequent manner, just because like it is news and it will expire shortly after that. So this is one of those things that's like, oh, it's going to be an evergreen topic, and it relates to Battlefront in the prequels being added to Battlefront 2 and how gamers will react to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think the prequels they're an interesting thing, and I think they hold a very misunderstood place in pop culture. One of the reasons why I thought I might even contact you was last summer I decided to do what I usually do on Twitter and bug my friends. And about once a year I'll just throw out there and say some things about why I like the Star Wars prequels. And, most of my friends will shut me down a little bit and like back off. And, there's only so many times you can get people dumping on you for it. But there's been that popular trend on Twitter of saying, for every like, I'll tell you something about myself. For every like, I'll tell you a favorite book. So one night I was at home and not doing much. My family had all fallen asleep, and I just said, all right, let's do this. One like, one cool thing about the Star Wars prequels, and very quickly within the next few days, I had thousands of likes. And so I started, trying to keep up. In the end, the thread, I sort of capped it at 500. I dove back in after a couple months break and finished it off at about 500 tweets. And one of the things I even talked about in the thread, somewhere in the 300s maybe, was that the prequels do have a lot of cool stuff. There's a lot of symbology happening there. There's a lot of intersections with politics and visual art and all these things that George Lucas was obsessed with, and not only him, but also his concept artists. And it's a very, very visually rich trilogy. Because he had the freedom of CG, which again is often vilified by the average moviegoer, he experimented like crazy with stuff. And we see it in the droid army. I mean, they were droids. They didn't have to be bipedal humanoids shooting at you. They could look like a tank tread that crossed with a snail and have laser guns on its face. And, or the spider droids, which look like something out of a Hieronymus Bosch painting. They're so weird. And, you could see that the concept artists and George Lucas and ILM just went to town with all these ideas. And I think what that did, since Star Wars has always been such a huge set of properties, for toys and video games and everything else, it gave everybody who wanted to make a game this huge catalog of models to draw from. And you see them in so many games that came out when the prequels were popular at the time. And everything from, there was that Clone Wars game a long, long time ago. I think I had it for GameCube.
Clone Commando?
There's Republic Commando, but there was another one that was just called Clone Wars, and it was not a very good art style. Lots of very bright purples and oranges and stuff. And it had some of the big scale battles, and occasionally you got to play as like Anakin and stuff. But it, I'll see if I can dig up a link for you or something to put in the description. But it, it just gave them sort of this wealth of things to draw from. This is pre-original Battlefront, this game I'm talking about. And I think what happened was you had like a generation of kids and teens who were, not me, I was in my 20s, but who watched the prequels and were playing all these games of varying quality at the time, and the quality certainly ramped up and got really nice with Republic Commando and the original Battlefront. And so all those toys in the toy box that the movies had created, it didn't matter that the movies had clunky dialogue or bored you with Senate politics. You got to play the games, which just dove into the action, and you got to have droids versus clones and all these amazing ships. And even the V-Wing. The V-Wing it's such an odd choice to even be in the movie. It has like a few seconds of screen time at the very end of Revenge of the Sith when they're escorting Emperor Palpatine's shuttle while he's carrying Anakin's burned body back to Coruscant. And, you just see them for the briefest of moments. I think that one of them lands on the same landing platform, so you sort of see its wings fold down. But it's not a ship that saw any action. It wasn't any of the big action sequences. But, it was kind of a everything plus the kitchen sink moment. George was doing his last Star Wars movie, and so, yeah, let's throw in another ship. A V-Wing. And that one looks cool too. Let's find a spot for it. And so suddenly you get this great ship, and now we get to play in another video game. And it's so I think gamers, the relationship that video game players have had with the Star Wars prequels is very different from moviegoers who saw them and were maybe turned off by the romance between Padme and Anakin, or hated the ones like this is pod racing or whatever it was.
Now this is pod racing.
And I think video gamers have a different appreciation for all of the world building that really went into those movies. And it's such a different thing when you get to play it. It's kind of look at the reactions of people on Reddit after playing the beta. And,
yeah.
Everybody loved playing the droids. They're hilarious. They have all these great voice lines.
Goodbye,
good luck,
grenade.
Yeah, all of those things. It's and again, like people sort of thought the droids are just silly in the theater. And I mean, they were meant to be, right? I mean, there's
Yeah. They were
there's a
the
behind
comic
scenes,
relief.
yeah, and there was a
And
behind the scenes moment in Phantom Menace where George Lucas was speaking to Steven Spielberg, who visited him, and he showed him one of the life-size models of a droid, and he said, "Yeah, these are the guys that, sort of kick off the first war, and they're not very good, which is why they get replaced by stormtroopers." And it was sort of a George Lucas just flat out saying, like, these guys are meant to be these disposable dummies, who this paves the way for why they needed to have clone troopers later in terms of an army. It's as the Kaminoan said, the clones are superior to droids. So, but
in every
yeah, so
other
I
way
think,
but aim.
yeah, I guess so. Yeah, so. But I think that's I think that's really the crux of it. I think that's why video game players are so excited to see prequel content, and and I understand people's frustration with wanting every
Everything.
notable member of the Jedi Council and clone who got a name on the Clone Wars show in the game as a hero or a reinforcement. I totally understand it. I mean, again, it's such a rich world. Like, I always thought the design for Luminara and Dooley was one of the best. I was like, wow, yeah, look at that female alien Jedi with tattoos on her face, and she's dressed like a space nun, and like, awesome. And would I love to see her in Battlefront? Sure. There's probably at least another dozen characters they should do before they put her in, but
Yeah, exactly. Like General Grievous.
yes, like General Grievous, or I know it's a controversial choice, but Padme as well. It's just to have one of the big heroes on screen. It's yeah. So it's I can definitely see why everybody's so amped to get the prequel content because we haven't played it in a long time. And that's the other thing. There hasn't been a prequel game in a while,
And especially to the scale, like Battlefront 2 is a gorgeous game. Like they are doing things. I think it's going to be one of the prettiest games that's coming out this year.
Absolutely.
It's on such a large scope that we've never gotten before. We got to play it kind of in that area with the original Battlefronts, but again, they had limited technology. They had some production issues. Like that game was made in a year,
Yes,
using a
that's
lot
right.
of the same
Really fast.
aspects. So this one's taking 2 years, 3 developers. So nothing to the scale has ever been done in Star Wars video games before. So especially with the prequel content, like for the longest time, fans were like, "Oh, now that Disney's bought them, we'll never see prequels again." That's not the case. Like as memes, especially, have been coming out on the original with the prequel Star Wars movies, people have the prequels have become in favor with the fans once again.
Absolutely. And again, I think it all just goes back to the fact that it's, I mean, there's some nostalgia driving it, absolutely. Again, for me, I was in my early 20s when the prequels came out. And, for a lot of people, that was their childhood. I have a nephew. He grew up with the prequels. My kids are growing up with the sequels. Everybody has their Star Wars. And I think, you're seeing a lot of people who watched and maybe played some of those games as a kid are now young adults, and they're saying, they want to get that rush back of flying an ARC 170 and that's what, again, that's partly what's driving some of the complaints about, oh, what do you mean we can't board capital ships or whatever? It's some of it's nostalgia, and not all of it, but I think the prequels just had such a huge impact in terms of world building because Star Wars we already knew was huge.
Yeah.
From the original trilogy, we got a very, there was many different environments. Like Cloud City and Jabba's palace don't have a lot in common. So to go from one to the other in the span of a few hours when you're watching that trilogy is really something. But the prequels just amped it up even further. I mean, we only saw a few glimpses of Felucia, and
Yeah.
I mean,
like you're saying, there's so many different characters in the prequels. Like it's insane. You could make 3 games on all of the content that was made in the prequels.
absolutely, yeah,
Like all the little no-name Jedi that you can find out through the books that have come out. Like they never get mentioned on screen, but they are detailed in the books in the extended universe, like in the encyclopedias.
Action figures.
Action
Yeah.
figures, like I know what I know about weapons because of Battlefront, like the weapons of Star Wars because of Battlefront. So
Yes.
one of our friends, he's a huge like Star Wars guy, and like he knows his Star Wars, but he does not know the weapons. So I was like, hey, you
Right.
know this weapon? I was like, wow, I can actually know something that this guy doesn't know.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing. Battlefront's another education, isn't it? And I think that's part of it too. Is that's what's so fun about when they tie in a book like Christy Golden's or Alexander Freed's, for the first game. It's such a fun thing because after you play the games and you're used to the handling of the ships, or you're used to the noise that a gun makes. It's when somebody picks one up in the book. You're much more specific in how that plays out in your head.
Yeah.
You can really envision it in a whole other way. Occasionally, when I'm painting, when I do my illustration work, I often like to listen to video game soundtracks. And one of the things, though, about that, people will recommend one to me, and they'll say, "Oh, you got to listen to this one, this game soundtrack." But I've never played that game, so I have no emotional hook to it. But for myself, as somebody who plays primarily, I'm a AAA game kind of person, but and I usually play either something Star Wars related or Assassin's Creed or Mass Effect. And so listening to one of those soundtracks, you're sort of reliving the story in your head, the emotions that you had when you played the game. And so it's such a different experience, again, to read a book or a comic and then somebody, pulls out a rocket launcher and you're like, I know what like, I know exactly what that's going to do. So, so it's definitely a fun aspect of the games that sort of immerses you in there. Jabba's palace, it felt humid,
Yeah.
It, that bathroom, so you don't want to run through that water.
No, you don't.
And you didn't either. That was the thing. Most people tended to run around the edge.
Exactly. I tried to stay away from that water as much as I could.
Yeah, totally. And that's the thing. I'm hungry for information with Battlefront 2, just like everybody. I look at the Reddit almost daily and see what people have uncovered. I pay attention to EA Star Wars on Twitter. But there's also that part of me that I really hope that the developers and the marketing team are keeping some stuff from us.
Yeah.
I would love to find out that on the Mos Eisley map, there's a part where if you do the right thing, a Rancor can get loose and just cause mayhem across the map. It's probably not going to happen, but I would just love to find that out on launch day. That they've put in some real surprises for the fans, and that go beyond specific fruit on the table.
Yeah.
Just something a little more dramatic and big. But who knows? We'll see what they've done. The gameplay in the beta was awfully fun. So
that's why our rule for leaks is like if IGN covers it, yeah, it's okay with the cover. Like, but if it's just like a tiny leak, someone broke their NDA, I was like, I don't want to cover that, just because it's like, oh my gosh, it's like I hope I can go into Battlefront once they launch and like they have all of the maps, the campaign, all that stuff. I can be like, oh my gosh, did you see that thing in the background? I know what that is. Like,
yeah, exactly, right. And it's that's part of the thrill of it, is discovering. It's just like watching the films that way, I think.
It's like when I watch Star Wars now,
Yeah.
I point out the weapons that I know. I'm like, they're using the Stinger pistol. Did you see those guys?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's and that's the thing. You sort of get immersed in. There's more details than you can possibly catch in one viewing of a Star Wars movie, and the games are like that too. Even some of those little triggered events that could happen on a few of the maps in the 2015 game. I didn't really know about a lot of those till I watched them in a YouTube video. The idea that I think it was if you're playing like Droid Run on the Jawa Refuge, if you were completely dominating if you were the rebels and you were completely dominating the Imperials on that map, then a couple of TIE fighters would be racing down the canyon being chased by an X-Wing. Or there was a couple of little things like that that would trigger. And it wasn't, I can't remember the exact mechanism, but there was these little things like that in there that each time those things happen, it makes the gameplay atmosphere different, even if it doesn't actually affect the gameplay. And that's kind of exciting when they can do something like that makes it feel like varied and random and like a living universe. But
yeah, the same thing doesn't happen twice.
Yeah, exactly. But it also isn't, it also isn't something that demolishes your team. It's happening off to the side.
It's not like those civilians will start breaking out guns and start defending their city.
I kind of feel bad for those civilians. Somebody should program them to actually do that one day. April Fool's Day.
This is our city, and we will defend it.
Yeah. So just turn around and open fire on the droids. But yeah.
Earlier you were mentioning Christy Golden. Her book, Star Wars Battlefront 2 Inferno Squad.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed it. I felt it was slow. It started really slow for me, but I think it added much more connection to the characters. I was still rooting for the rebels the whole time, but I was like, oh, okay, I can understand these characters.
Yeah.
Finally, a rebel guy on the show.
Yeah, it was definitely. I really enjoyed it. I'm reading it through a second time, sort of looking for different. Almost trying to learn. I don't write fiction, but just trying to learn from sort of her narrative impulse. And I mentioned to her on Twitter after I finished it, and she's great about responding on Twitter, which I love.
She is.
And I said to her, I was really impressed by, not to get too political, but I was really impressed by how. The Empire are the bad guys. I know some people the Empire has much cooler toys, so it's very popular to sort of say, well, the rebels are terrorist scum, but it's, at the same time, the Empire's going around blowing up planets to scare people, so
yeah.
I feel comfortable calling them the bad guys. So we're playing a game where we're going to be in the shoes of the bad guys. And here's the book sort of explaining who they are and their point of view. And one of the things that I thought was really well done, by and large, the members of Inferno Squad seem like nice enough people for, hardened soldiers. They have a job to do. But there was also this sort of understanding that they were very smug about the fact that they knew the Empire was the better way.
Yes.
And they were not really open to learning from anyone else. And it had a real sort of, I won't tie it to modern politics. Let's say it had a really colonial vibe. The idea that, these Spaniards and French and English are going to come to the New World and tell these people, our way of living is better than yours and you'd better conform. And there was definitely sort of a quiet strain of that through the book. It's not hitting you over the head, but Iden Versio knows that Vardos is better off in the Empire, and these rebels don't get that, and they're wrong. And she's not willing to hear their point of view too much. And
it's annoying because I love hearing other people's point of view. Like, even if I disagree with, I want to hear your thoughts. Like, why do you think this thing? But she's just like, no, we are the way, the truth, and we know what's best for you. Now come to the dark side, which we think is the light side.
Yeah, totally. And there's a certain lack of empathy for other people that are different or have been raised differently. I live in Toronto, Canada, which is one of the most multicultural cities on the planet. And we have our problems, absolutely. But, it is one of those things where you look at this. There's people in my life I've known that have an attitude maybe similar to Iden Versio's. And it's not that you don't like them. Maybe it's a family member or something. But they're very rigid in their set of beliefs, and they're not willing to entertain the idea that other people could be happy living differently. And I thought that Christy Golden did a really nice job of portraying them as interesting and sympathetic characters. You're kind of rooting for her to, overcome that sense of failure she has around her father. And she's always trying to impress the guy, and He's never impressed by anything,
which like you can
so,
relate to as a
yeah,
human being,
yeah.
which is like it's perfect. But then you're like, but then she starts saying these things like, oh my gosh, like she's just
Yeah, exactly right. Like there's relatable points, and I do think that sort of speaks to the fact that I mean, human beings are complicated, and I think it was a really nice way to. I do think Christy Golden had a tough one, and I think also Mitch Dyer and the other writers
yes, they're going to have
had
a hard time.
It's a tough one, um, and I will say, especially in today's modern political climate, there's everybody's maybe, or a lot of people are a little bit worried about the rise of tyranny and youth embracing tyranny. And now you've got a game where, one of the most beloved properties of all time, and we're playing as the bad guy. It's almost bad timing. As much as I'm excited to play it, it's it's almost so I think that'll be an interesting thing too. We'll have to see how the story plays out, and I don't think by the end of it I'm going to be rooting for the Empire too much, but I might be rooting for Persia. So
yeah, on Twitter there was Paul Kesslin, Azatru or Aurora. Their pictures on Twitter are both blue, so I get those two confused.
Yeah.
John Stanley and then Alan Frank, and then like a couple of random people as well. We were all on this like probably like 40 tweet thread of GIFs. Like it was hilarious, and like John Stanley and I are rooting for the rebels, and then Paul Kesslin and Alan Frank are Imperial guys. So we're just like down with the Imperial tyranny. But one thing I was like, in regards to the campaign, I was like, I am a rebel boy through and through, but I will, even as I'm mowing down rebels with my machine guns as Iden Versio, I will still be rooting for the rebels.
Yeah. Yeah, totally right. And I think that's it. It's Star Wars. I mean, because it's a fantasy, it allows you to dress up as the bad guys, and the bad guys in Star Wars are fun. I mean,
yeah,
Darth Maul, Darth Vader, Grievous, right down to the individual stormtroopers and all their different gear. I mean, the first time I ever saw a biker scout, I was 9 years old, and I was just like, that's the coolest looking stormtrooper yet.
Yeah.
And it was, so, the bad guys have great toys in Star Wars. Like they've got all the cool bits. So.
And Star Wars does something very unique in film. Like when it first started, it showed both perspectives. So, you got to see your main character, which is Luke, Han, Leia, but then you also got to switch to Darth Vader to see what they were doing. Like before, it was like always the good guys trying, in ignorance, trying to defeat these bad guys. But now you, as the viewer, know what the bad guys are doing. So you're like in this very interesting thing, like, oh no, what's going to happen? You see these things from the Imperial's point of view, as well as the rebels from a certain point of view.
Yeah, exactly. And that's such a fascinating thing to watch in the movies, because it at the same time, it doesn't really humanize the bad guys that much. Like when I'm thinking about the big ones, like Vader discussing things with the Emperor, they both clearly have plans. They both clearly have wants. Vader is put in his place sometimes, but it's you're watching them, and they're still real characters. They're not just completely generic mustache twirling villains.
Yeah,
they still have goals, and a friend of mine years ago, when we went to see Phantom Menace, it came back out. I can't remember the reason why. Maybe it was when it was in 3D. But one of the things that he pointed out about Darth Maul, which has always stuck with me, shout out to Adam Swinburne, who said this, but about Darth Maul in Phantom Menace has almost no voice lines. And George Lucas put in the perfect moment for a typical James Bond villain speech. When Qui-Gon is kneeling behind the energy barrier, and Darth Maul is just pacing back and forth like a caged animal. That's the moment when, in most movies, Darth Maul would give
here's my elaborate plan.
here's why I'm fighting you. Here's what I'm going to do to you. Here's our plan, so you can go and undo it. And that's the moment when that always happens in movies. But George Lucas didn't do it, and instead it made Darth Mauls so much scarier. And I think, because he was there on a mission, and he was single-minded, and he wasn't talking to them. He was just going to kill them as fast as he could. And I'm a guy who loves the prequels. People call me an apologist. Like I say, I wrote 500 tweets of cool things in the Star Wars prequels. The one thing in the whole thing I would change is not even Jar Jar. I would change killing off Darth Maul in Phantom Menace. I know he comes back in Clone Wars and Rebels.
Yeah, I don't think he should.
I
love Darth Maul, but I think I love seeing more of Darth Maul, but his character, I think, had a specific arc that was good where they left it in the prequels. Like, I didn't like how they brought him back in the Clone Wars, and then in the Rebels they kill him again, and Obi-Wan's the guy to do it. Like, he should be, but he should have been killed right off.
See, I kind of think what they should have done was kept him around for all 3 prequel movies, so that when Anakin becomes the new Darth, it had a bigger impact.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I like about him is, that little bit in the hangar on Naboo near the end of Phantom Menace, the door's open and he's standing there, and he takes his hood down, pulls out the double-bladed lightsaber. It's such a great gotcha moment. There's so much happening in the movie. Padme's got plans. The Gungans are going to fight the droids on the plains. There's all these things happening. And then Darth Maul shows up. Oh, crap, we forgot about that guy. It's hard to watch it again after you've seen it 100 times and have that sense of surprise. But when it first came out, it was like, oh snap, here he is. I think he would have been a great boogeyman for Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. And you could still have a Dooku as a fallen Jedi politician, propped up leader of the Separatists. You could still have a character like that without making him a Sith. But I think it would have been much more interesting if Darth Maul was sort of a Mephistopheles character, goading him, or pushing this Jedi into doing these bad acts, sort of as a devil on his shoulder type of character, and then every once in a while pop out and kill some Jedi and scare everybody. I think he just would have been I think it was sort of a missed opportunity but at the same time, something else I've noted in that big Twitter thread, the other thing that's interesting about how George Lucas approached the villains, and I think why people are so excited to see them in Battlefront 2, is if you look at Darth Maul is scary, and has a scary face, and and he's very dangerous with the Force and with a lightsaber. And then you have Dooku, Darth Tyrannus, who's sort of elegant and regal in his bearing, and then you have Grievous, who's this cyborg monster. And I think when you add up all 3 of those are Darth Vader, because he has all of those traits. And so what George Lucas essentially did was he took Darth Vader and said, break him into 3. Those are the 3 villains of the prequels. And in a way, Darth Vader is sort of a culmination of the people that Palpatine was gathering around him. He sort of took pieces of them and cobbled together Vader, in a symbolic way. I don't mean in a literal, he wrote that down, kind of a way. But I think that's one of the things that makes, I don't want to jump into the cross-era discussion too much, but, that's one of the things that's interesting about the idea of Darth Vader fighting Grievous or Dooku once he's Vader. It's, he has elements of all 3 of those guys in him, and he sort of relates to them in a villainous way, So it's an interesting visual anyway, seeing somebody like, even the color palette for Grievous versus the color palette for Vader. Vader is all black with a bit of red, and Grievous is mostly sort of an off-white with, he's got some green in his little gut sack there, and so
a fine addition to my collection.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think that's a good spot to end the episode. You talking about that made me think of one of my favorite podcast networks, Storywonk, also known as Pointing North Media.
I don't know it.
He does.
Storywonk, I'll write it down.
He does a series called Story and Star Wars, where he breaks down the Star Wars movies into narrative beats.
Cool.
And it is really good. It makes you look at the prequels and the original trilogy and the sequel trilogy in a new light, because this guy knows story.
Cool.
Like his whole podcast network is about breaking down the stories of books, TV, film. So
Right.
I would definitely recommend that. I will put
Yeah, for sure.
a link in the description as well.
That's great. Yeah, I've read a lot of Mike Klimo's stuff from the Ring Theory. You know, have you seen that at all? The Ring Theory of Star Wars.
I don't think so.
It's a guy named Mike Klimo wrote this huge sort of essay on a bunch of web pages that he has there, and it's basically he looks visually at the movie and from a filming perspective talks about the narrative structure being a series of nested rings. And so parallels in Phantom Menace are almost exactly backward to what happens in Return of the Jedi, and then Attack of the Clones with Empire, and of course Revenge of the Sith with Return of the Jedi, or sorry, with screwed that up with A New Hope. And so there's even moments where he'll point out that in Phantom Menace and in Return of the Jedi, at exactly, I forget how many minutes, but let's say 8 minutes in, there's a hologram. And, it'll be the hologram of Darth Sidious in Phantom Menace, and it's the hologram of Luke talking to Jabba in Return of the Jedi. And there's these things that happen in the films that are in no way possibly a coincidence that George Lucas did. And there's even, at the exact center point of Attack of the Clones, Anakin is standing on Padme's balcony looking at the clouds, and she wakes up, comes out and speaks to him. The clouds literally have a yin-yang symbol in the clouds. And I've watched that movie 1,000 times until he pointed it out. I'd never noticed it. I went and put my DVD back in. And, oh yeah, it's there. And it's the exact center point of the movie. And so there's a lot of visual symbology that Mike Klimo has sort of uncovered with his Ring Theory. It's quite a fascinating read. Get some cup of cocoa and curl up with that sometime. Yeah.
Well, thank you for reaching out and bringing this great topic of the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It's fascinating. Yeah.
It was fun to have you on and get a different perspective on the prequels, since you are such a big fan. That's all for this episode of the Star Wars Battlefront Podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at SWBP Podcast, twitter.com/SWBP Podcast. You can find Glendon on Twitter.
That's right, at Flying Trilobite, which is also my Xbox username if you ever see me out there in the Battlefront.
Awesome. Our Patreon is patreon.com/Battlefront Podcast. We're still working on the details of our Patreon exclusive show, but it will feature a deeper dive into Battlefront 2 once it releases. You can also support us through paypal.me/tie-dye-sheep, TYEDYESHEEP. We have a Discord. A Discord will be in the description of the podcast, so definitely make sure you try and join that, because it is a super fun place to just geek out about Battlefront.
Awesome.
You can leave us a review on iTunes and enter our Battlefront 2 giveaway. We're about to open that up to everyone, but if you do leave a review, you get 5 more entries into that than a normal a giveaway enter. We have a YouTube channel, the Star Wars Battlefront Podcast on YouTube. Search that, and our YouTube channel will come up. You can leave us feedback through email, battlefrontpodcast@gmail.com. Also talk to us through there. We read all the emails, the tweets, the messages. So if you want to contact us in any way, it's open. You can listen to the podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. As always,
may the Force be with you.